A debt-ridden rancher gave his last bread to a native the next day. An entire herd appeared grazing on his land. The morning sun carved long shadows across the cracked earth of Colorado Territory. 1873, when Marcus Thornfield discovered something that would change everything he thought he knew about survival, honor, and the mysterious ways the frontier repaid kindness. But that discovery lay hours ahead. Right now, standing in the doorway of his weathered cabin, Marcus could only see the latest catastrophe painted across his drought-stricken ranch. 3 more of his remaining cattle had died overnight, their bloated carcasses already drawing buzzards in the pale dawn light. The sight hit him like a physical blow, each dead animal representing another nail in the coffin of his failing operation. At 38, Marcus had weathered more storms than most men twice his age. His hands bore the permanent stains of honest work. His face carried lines etched by sun and worry, and his shoulders had grown accustomed to carrying burdens that would crush lesser men. But this morning, staring at the evidence of his crumbling dreams, something inside him threatened to break. The drought had lasted 8 months. 8 months without decent rain, watching his grass turn to dust and his water sources dwindle to muddy puddles. The banknotes scattered across his kitchen table told their own brutal story. $247 in debt, with another payment due in 12 days. His credit exhausted, his neighbors avoiding his desperate eyes, his cattle dying faster than he could bury them. Marcus pulled his worn hat lower against the climbing sun and walked toward the nearest carcass. The buzzards scattered reluctantly, their patience rewarded by his misfortune. As he bent to examine the animal, searching for any sign of disease that might explain the sudden deaths, a movement in his peripheral vision made him straighten. A figure approached from the eastern ridge, walking with the steady gait of someone who had traveled far. At this distance, Marcus could make out little more than a silhouette against the brightening sky. But something about the way the person moved suggested youth and determination. In these parts, unexpected visitors usually brought trouble, debt collectors, or both. Marcus wiped his hands on his pants and walked back toward the cabin, his eyes never leaving the approaching figure. As the distance closed, details began to emerge. Dark hair braided down her back, worn leather clothing that had seen hard use, and a face that belonged to someone who understood hardship but had not yet surrendered to it. She was young, probably no more than 20, with the kind of natural grace that comes from a lifetime spent outdoors. Her skin carried the warm bronze of someone who worked under the open sky, and her dark eyes held an intelligence that immediately commanded respect. Most striking was the quiet confidence in her bearing, the way she carried herself like someone who belonged wherever she chose to stand. "Morning," she called out when she reached speaking distance, her voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus could not immediately place. "Morning," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "You look like you have been walking a while. Can I offer you some water?" She studied him for a moment, those dark eyes seeming to take in everything at once. The failed ranch, the dead cattle, the weariness that hung around him like smoke from a dying fire. That would be kind. Marcus led her toward the cabin, acutely aware of how it must look to an outsider. The porch sagged in 2 places, the windows needed washing, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly eastward, as if exhausted by the effort of standing upright. Inside was no better. Dust coated every surface, dirty dishes filled the wash basin, and the bank notices on the table proclaimed his failures to anyone who cared to look. He poured water from his last clean pitcher into a tin cup, noticing how little remained in the bottom. The well had not run dry yet, but it dropped lower each day, another reminder of how completely the land had turned against him. "Thank you." She accepted the cup with both hands, a gesture that seemed oddly formal. "I am Elena Proudhorse." The name carried weight, though Marcus could not immediately place why. In the frontier territories, names often carried stories, reputations that traveled faster than the people who bore them. Marcus Thornfield. This is my ranch. He paused, looking around at the evident decay. What is left of it? Alina sipped the water slowly, making it last. You have been here long? 3 years. Came out from Missouri with big plans and what I thought was enough money. He gestured toward the window, where the dead cattle were visible in the distance. The land had other ideas. She nodded as if this story was familiar to her. The drought has been hard on everyone. You know these parts? I know this land better than most. She finished the water and set the cup on the table with careful precision. My people have been here longer than memory. The words clicked into place suddenly. Proud Horse. Marcus had heard stories, fragments of conversations in the saloons of Cedar Ridge, the nearest town. The Proud Horse family were respected among the local tribes, known for their wisdom and their ability to survive where others perished. They understood the rhythms of this harsh country in ways that newcomers like Marcus could only dream of mastering. You are Cheyenne, he said, not a question but a recognition. My mother was. My father was a trader who understood that survival meant adapting. Elena's eyes moved to the bank notices scattered across the table, taking in the numbers and dates with quick comprehension. These lands are unforgiving to those who fight against their nature. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. Embarrassed by his obvious failures laid bare before someone who clearly understood the country far better than he did. I suppose you think I am just another fool who came west expecting easy money. I think you are a man who has worked hard and found himself caught between two worlds. The world you came from and the world you are trying to build here. She moved to the window, looking out at the expanse of brown grass and distant mountains. The question is whether you are ready to learn a different way. Before Marcus could ask what she meant, Elena turned back toward him with an expression he could not read. When did you last eat? The question caught him off guard. Yesterday. Had some beans left from the day before. And today? Marcus glanced toward the empty shelves, the bare cupboards that told their own story. Today I was planning to ride into town, see if anyone needs work done. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Cedar Ridge was 20 miles away, and his horse had thrown a shoe 3 days ago. He had no money for repairs, no credit for supplies, and no realistic prospect of finding work that would pay enough to matter. Today he had been planning to sit on his porch and watch his dreams die a little more, same as every day for the past month. Elena walked to the cupboard and opened it, confirming what they both already knew. Empty shelves stared back at them, holding nothing but dust and the ghosts of better times. She moved to the next cabinet, then the next, her search thorough but not intrusive. Finally, in the last cabinet, behind a stack of unused plates, she found what Marcus had forgotten he still possessed. A single loaf of bread, baked 4 days ago and now hard as a rock, but still technically edible if soaked in water or coffee. His absolute last food, hoarded unconsciously against the moment when even hope would be gone. This is all you have, she said, holding the stale loaf. That is all I have, Marcus admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Elena looked at the bread, then at him, then back at the bread. Something passed across her face, an emotion too quick to identify, but deep enough to change the entire atmosphere of the small cabin. She walked to the stove, where a pot of water still held warmth from his morning coffee. May I? Marcus nodded, not sure what she was asking permission for, but trusting her instincts more than his own at this point. Elena broke the hard bread into pieces and dropped them into the warm water, working them with a wooden spoon until they softened into something resembling porridge. My grandmother taught me that bread shared always returns tenfold, she said while stirring. But bread hoarded turns to dust in your mouth. She divided the softened bread between 2 bowls, handing him the larger portion despite his weak protests. They ate in silence, the simple meal somehow carrying more significance than Marcus understood. The bread was still stale, the texture strange, but it filled the gnawing emptiness in his stomach and seemed to restore some small measure of strength to his weary body. Why? Marcus asked when they had finished. Why what? Why share my last meal with me? You do not know me. I have nothing to offer in return." Elena stood and moved to the window again, her gaze directed toward the eastern hills from which she had come. "My people have a saying. The land remembers every kindness and every cruelty. It keeps accounts better than any banker. That sounds like superstition, does it?" She turned back to him, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that made him reconsider his quick dismissal. "You have been fighting this land for 3 years, trying to force it to give you what you want. Has that worked?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable in any way that would preserve his pride. Marcus looked around his failing cabin, thought about his dead cattle and empty coffers, and recognized the brutal truth she was offering him. "No," he said finally, "it has not worked. Then perhaps it is time to try a different approach." Elena moved toward the door, her purpose apparently accomplished. Marcus felt a sudden panic at the thought of her leaving, though he could not have explained why. In the space of an hour, she had become the most interesting and hopeful thing to enter his life in months. "Wait," he called out. "Where are you going?" "Home," she said simply, "but I will return." "When?" She paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning light. "When the land is ready to show you what it has been trying to teach you." Before Marcus could ask what that meant, Elena Proudhorse walked out into the Colorado sunshine and began making her way back toward the eastern ridge. He stood in his doorway watching until she disappeared over the horizon, leaving him alone with questions he did not know how to ask and a strange sense that something fundamental had just shifted in his small world. The rest of that day passed in a haze of routine desperation. Marcus buried the dead cattle, checked his dwindling water supply, and tried to make sense of the encounter that had disrupted his morning. By evening, he had almost convinced himself that Elena Proudhorse had been a figment of his hungry imagination, a hallucination brought on by stress and malnutrition. But when he looked in the cabinet, the bread was gone, and 2 bowls sat clean and dry beside his wash basin, proof that kindness had visited his failing ranch and left him with more questions than answers. That night, Marcus lay in his narrow bed listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in his cabin walls, and for the first time in months, he fell asleep without the crushing weight of hopelessness pressing down on his chest. Something had changed, though he could not name what it was or why it mattered. He dreamed of vast herds moving across endless grasslands, of water flowing where now there was only dust, and of a young woman with dark eyes who understood secrets the land had been trying to tell him for 3 years. In his dreams, the secrets finally made sense, and when morning came, Marcus Thornfield would wake to discover that some dreams carry more truth than reality ever dared to offer. Dawn broke with unusual clarity, the air crisp and clean in a way Marcus had not experienced since the drought began. He woke feeling strangely refreshed, as if the brief encounter with Elena Proudhorse had somehow restored something essential that he had lost along with his cattle and his hope. The sensation was so foreign after months of waking to dread that he lay still for several minutes, afraid that movement might shatter this fragile peace. Outside, the familiar sounds of morning in a dying ranch greeted him. The wind rustling through brown grass, the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, the creaking of his cabin settling in the warming air. But something else caught his attention, a sound that did not belong in his current reality. Water, the sound of running water. Marcus bolted upright, certain his mind was playing tricks on him. The creek that ran through his property had been dry for 4 months, reduced to a series of cracked mud puddles that disappeared a little more each day. But the sound persisted, clear and unmistakable, flowing water moving over stone and earth. He dressed quickly, his heart hammering with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Outside, the morning light revealed what his ears had already reported. The creek was running again, not the mighty flow it had been before the drought, but a steady stream of clear water that caught the early sunlight like scattered diamonds. Marcus knelt beside the water, cupping it in his hands and bringing it to his lips. It tasted clean and cold, better than any water he remembered from before his troubles began. He drank deeply, then splashed his face, wondering if he was still dreaming or if the land had somehow decided to offer him one last chance. The sound of approaching hooves made him look up from the creek. A rider was coming from the direction of Cedar Ridge, moving at an easy pace that suggested no particular urgency. As the distance closed, Marcus recognized the weathered face of Samuel Morrison, one of the more successful ranchers in the territory and a man who had been notably absent during Marcus's recent struggles. "Morning, Thornfield," Morrison called out as he reined in his horse beside the creek. His eyes took in the flowing water with obvious surprise. "Well, I will be damned. When did this start running again?" "This morning," Marcus replied, still not quite believing it himself. Woke up to the sound of it. Morrison dismounted and led his horse to the water, letting the animal drink while he studied the unexpected flow. "Strange thing that. Had 3 inches of rain on my spread 2 days ago, but that should not be enough to get your creek running again. This comes from higher up in the mountains, and those springs have been bone dry since last summer." The information sent a chill down Marcus's spine. If the mountain springs had been dry, where was this water coming from? He thought about Elena's words regarding the land remembering kindness, and for a moment entertained the impossible notion that their shared meal had somehow triggered this miraculous change. "What brings you out this way, Morrison?" Marcus asked, pushing aside thoughts that bordered on superstition. "Actually came to talk business with you." Morrison's tone carried an unusual note of respect. Different from the pity and condescension Marcus had grown accustomed to receiving from his more successful neighbors. "Been hearing things in town about your situation. Thought you might be interested in a proposition." Marcus felt his defenses rise automatically. In his experience, propositions from successful men usually meant charity disguised as opportunity, handouts dressed up to preserve the recipient's dignity. "What kind of proposition?" "The kind that might solve both our problems." Morrison gestured toward the eastern hills, the same direction from which Elena had appeared the day before. "Got a contract to supply beef to the new mining operation up in Silverton. More cattle than I can handle with my current setup. Need someone who knows this country and is not afraid of hard work. You want to hire me?" "Want to partner with you. 60-40 split, your favor, since you would be doing most of the trail work. I provide the initial cattle investment. You provide the labor and local knowledge. After we fulfill this contract, you keep whatever profits can get you back on your feet." Marcus stared at the man, searching for the catch that had to be hidden in such a generous offer. "Why me?" "You could hire any number of experienced hands, because you are the only man I know who has been fighting this land for 3 years and still gets up every morning to try again. That kind of stubborn determination is exactly what this job needs." Morrison paused, looking around at the evidence of Marcus's struggles. "Besides, heard something interesting about you yesterday." "What did you hear?" "Tom Bradley was in town, said he saw a Cheyenne girl heading in this direction yesterday morning. Same Tom said he saw her leaving a few hours later, but she looked different somehow. Peaceful, like she had accomplished something important." Morrison's eyes fixed on Marcus with new intensity. "The Cheyenne do not usually visit struggling white ranchers unless there is a specific reason. Made me curious about what kind of man might earn that sort of attention." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly understood. In a territory where relations between white settlers and native tribes remain tense at best, a peaceful visit from someone like Elena Proudhorse suggested a level of character that transcended usual racial boundaries. "She was hungry," Marcus said simply. "I shared what food I had." Morrison nodded slowly, as if this explanation confirmed something he had already suspected. "Like I said, that kind of character is exactly what I need for this job. You interested?" Marcus looked around at his failing ranch, at the impossible creek flowing with clear water, at the dead cattle that would soon need replacing anyway. The offer represented salvation, a chance to climb out of the hole that had been consuming him for months. But more than that, it felt like vindication of Elena's mysterious words about the land remembering kindness. "I am interested," he said finally. "Good. Can you be ready to ride to Silverton in 3 days? Want to look at the mining operation, get a feel for what they need. I can be ready." Morrison mounted his horse, clearly satisfied with the morning's work. "One more thing, Thornfield. Heard tell the Proudhorse family has some influence with the local tribes. If that girl took a liking to you, it might be worth maintaining that connection. Could be useful for someone planning to move cattle through this territory." After Morrison rode away, Marcus stood beside the flowing creek trying to process the rapid change in his circumstances. 24 hours ago, he had been a failed rancher with no food, no money, and no prospects. This morning, he had running water and a business partnership that could restore everything he had lost. The coincidence was too perfect, too precisely timed to feel entirely natural. Elena's visit, the mysterious return of water to his creek, Morrison's sudden interest in partnership. Each element by itself might be explained by chance, but together they formed a pattern that suggested something more deliberate at work. Marcus spent the rest of the day preparing for his changed circumstances. He cleaned his cabin thoroughly, organized his few remaining possessions, and began planning what he would need for the journey to Silverton. The physical activity felt good after months of listless despair, and for the first time in recent memory, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it. As evening approached, he sat on his porch watching the sun set over the mountains, listening to the peaceful sound of water flowing through his property. The creek caught the golden light, transforming his previously barren land into something that almost resembled the prosperous ranch he had originally envisioned. Movement on the eastern ridge caught his attention. A familiar figure was silhouetted against the darkening sky, standing motionless for several minutes before beginning the descent toward his cabin. Elena Proudhorse had returned, just as she had promised. This time Marcus was ready for her. He walked out to meet her halfway, his steps more confident than they had been the previous morning. The change in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Where yesterday he had carried the weight of defeat in his shoulders, tonight he moved with the bearing of a man who had rediscovered hope. "You said the land would show me what it was trying to teach," Marcus called out when she came within speaking distance. "Was that lesson supposed to involve running water appearing overnight?" Elena smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth he had seen from her. "The land teaches many lessons. Some people learn to listen, and some people receive mysterious visits from successful ranchers offering partnership deals the day after sharing their last meal with strangers. Morrison is a practical man. He recognizes opportunity when it presents itself." Elena's tone suggested she knew exactly what had transpired between Marcus and his visitor. "The question is whether you understand what kind of opportunity you have truly been given." They walked together toward the cabin, the sound of the flowing creek providing a gentle soundtrack to their conversation. Marcus noticed that Elena moved with even more confidence than before, as if his property had somehow become familiar territory to her overnight. "I understand that my circumstances have changed dramatically in 24 hours, Marcus said. "What I do not understand is why. Perhaps because you finally learned the difference between taking from the land and receiving from it. That sounds like philosophy. I am more interested in practical explanations." Elena paused beside the creek, kneeling to cup the clear water in her hands. "This water comes from a spring high in the mountains. That spring has been dry for 8 months because the spirits that guard it were displeased with how the land was being treated by the newcomers." "Spirits," Marcus repeated, trying to keep skepticism out of his voice. "You can call them spirits, or you can call them the natural forces that govern this territory. The name does not change their reality." Elena stood, water still dripping from her cupped palms. "Yesterday, you performed an act of genuine generosity. You gave your last food to a stranger, asking nothing in return. That act demonstrated that you understand the most important law of this land, which is, survival depends on community. No one prospers alone in country this harsh. Those who hoard resources die with full storehouses. Those who share freely find that abundance comes to them from unexpected sources. Marcus considered her words while watching the water flow past his boots. The explanation felt both impossible and perfectly logical. Superstition and practical wisdom wrapped together in a way that defied easy dismissal. So the water returned because I shared my bread? The water returned because you demonstrated that you could be trusted with abundance. A man who gives away his last meal can be counted on to use prosperity wisely. Elena began walking again, leading him toward the cabin. The partnership with Morrison, the opportunity in Silverton, these are not coincidences. They are the natural result of proving yourself worthy of the land's trust. Inside the cabin, Elena moved with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. She lit the oil lamp without asking permission, put water on the stove for coffee, and settled into the single chair as if it were her customary place. Marcus found her presence both comforting and unsettling, like having a benevolent spirit take up residence in his home. "There is something else you need to understand," she said, while waiting for the water to heat. "The partnership with Morrison is just the beginning. If you handle this opportunity correctly, it will lead to greater things. But the land will be watching to see whether success changes your character." "What do you mean?" "I mean that generosity is easy when you have nothing left to lose. The real test comes when you have something worth protecting." Elena's dark eyes reflected the lamplight, giving her an almost otherworldly appearance. "Many men who start with good hearts become selfish once they taste prosperity. And if I fail that test? Then the water stops flowing, the partnerships dissolve, and you find yourself back where you started. Only this time, there will be no second chances." The weight of her words settled over Marcus like a physical presence. He was being offered salvation, but it came with conditions that would govern the rest of his life. Success would require him to remain the kind of man who would share his last meal with a stranger, even when he had barns full of grain and herds covering his pastures. "Why me?" he asked. "There must be dozens of failed ranchers in this territory. What makes me worth saving?" Elena rose and moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. "Because you are the only one who shared his bread." The simple statement carried more meaning than a lengthy explanation. In a territory where survival often depended on looking out for yourself first, Marcus had instinctively chosen generosity over self-preservation. That choice had marked him as someone worth investing in, someone whose success would benefit the entire community rather than just himself. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the old days," Elena continued, "when the buffalo covered these plains like a moving sea. The herds were so vast that hunting them seemed like trying to empty the ocean with a cup. But the buffalo disappeared because people took more than they needed and gave nothing back. You think the same thing could happen to the cattle ranchers? I think it could happen to anyone who forgets that abundance is a gift, not a right." She turned back toward him, her expression serious but not ominous. "The land has chosen to give you another chance, Marcus Thornfield. How you use that chance will determine not just your fate, but the fate of others who might follow your example." The responsibility felt overwhelming. Marcus had spent 3 years simply trying to survive, to carve out a small piece of prosperity in an unforgiving landscape. Now he was being told that his actions would influence the success or failure of an entire way of life. "What if I am not strong enough? What if prosperity does change me?" "Then you will learn what it means to lose everything twice." Elena's tone was matter of fact, neither threatening nor reassuring. "But I do not think that will happen. A man who worries about becoming selfish rarely does." She moved toward the door, her business apparently concluded. Marcus felt the same panic he had experienced the day before, the fear of being left alone with more questions than answers. "Will I see you again?" That depends on the choices you make in the coming months. Elena paused in the doorway, silhouetted once again against the star-filled sky. If you remember what you learned yesterday, if you keep the promises you have not yet made, then yes, you will see me again. What promises? The promises the land will ask of you when your fortunes change. When that time comes, you will know what they are. Elena disappeared into the darkness, leaving Marcus alone with the sound of running water and the weight of an uncertain future. He sat in his chair long into the night, thinking about bread and water and the strange alchemy that transforms generosity into prosperity. Tomorrow he would begin preparing for the journey to Silverton, the first step in what could become a complete transformation of his circumstances. But tonight, he simply listened to the creek flow and tried to understand the magnitude of what was being offered to him. Outside, the Colorado night stretched endlessly in all directions, full of possibilities that had not existed 24 hours before. 3 weeks passed like pages turning in a book Marcus had never dared to imagine himself reading. The journey to Silverton proved more successful than either he or Morrison had anticipated. The mining operation was expanding rapidly, their need for beef almost insatiable, and the prices they were willing to pay exceeded anything Marcus had seen in his years of struggling agriculture. More importantly, Marcus discovered that he possessed an intuitive understanding of moving cattle through mountain terrain that impressed even Morrison's experienced hands. His 3 years of failure had taught him to read the land in ways that success never could, to notice the subtle signs that meant the difference between safe passage and disaster. The contract they negotiated would require regular deliveries over the next 18 months, enough consistent income to not only clear Marcus's debts but to rebuild his operation on a scale he had never originally envisioned. For the first time since arriving in Colorado Territory, he allowed himself to believe that prosperity might actually be within reach. But prosperity, as Elena had warned, brought its own challenges. Marcus returned to his ranch to find that word of his partnership with Morrison had spread throughout the territory. Suddenly, neighbors who had avoided him during his struggles appeared at his door with offers of assistance, advice, and friendship. Merchants in Cedar Ridge extended credit without question. The local bank, which had been preparing to foreclose on his property, now spoke of expansion loans and investment opportunities. The attention was both gratifying and unsettling. Marcus could not shake Elena's warning about how success might change his character, especially when he caught himself enjoying the newfound respect a little too much. The creek continued to flow steadily, providing enough water to support a much larger herd than his previous operation. Morrison had already arranged for the delivery of 50 head of prime cattle, the foundation of what would become a substantial ranching enterprise. Everything was falling into place with an efficiency that felt almost supernatural. On a bright Thursday morning in early October, Marcus stood in his doorway drinking coffee and watching his small herd graze in the meadow beside the flowing creek. The sight filled him with a satisfaction deeper than anything he had experienced during his years of struggle. This was what he had originally envisioned when he came west, the dream that had sustained him through drought and debt and near starvation. The sound of approaching riders interrupted his reverie. A group of men on horseback was coming from the direction of Cedar Ridge, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than social calling. As they drew closer, Marcus recognized the lead rider as Sheriff William Cross, a fair but uncompromising man who commanded respect throughout the territory. "Morning, Thornfield," Sheriff Cross called out as the group reined in near the cabin. "Mind if we water our horses at your creek?" "Help yourselves," Marcus replied, though something in the sheriff's manner suggested this was not a routine stop. The men dismounted and led their horses to the water while Sheriff Cross approached the porch. His expression was serious, the kind of professional gravity that usually preceded unpleasant conversations. "Heard about your partnership with Morrison," the sheriff said. "Good news for you, I imagine. It has been a welcome change in my circumstances." "I am sure it has, Sheriff." Cross removed his hat and wiped his brow, despite the cool morning air. Thing is, we have got a situation developing that might affect those circumstances. Marcus felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same dread that had become his constant companion during the worst days of his troubles. What kind of situation? Cattle rustling. Been happening all over the territory for the past month. Professional operation, not the usual small-time thieves we normally deal with. They hit the Henderson place last week, made off with 40 head in a single night. You think they might target my operation? I think they might target any operation that looks successful. Word travels fast in country like this, and your recent good fortune has not gone unnoticed. Sheriff Cross gestured toward the grazing cattle. 50 head of prime beef represents a substantial temptation for men willing to take risks. Implications were clear. Marcus had worked too hard and come too far to lose everything to thieves. But the sheriff's visit also represented something more troubling. His newfound prosperity was making him a target, drawing unwanted attention that could destroy everything he was trying to build. What do you suggest? Extra vigilance for starters. Keep your cattle close to the buildings at night. Post watches if you can afford the help. Most importantly, report anything suspicious immediately. These rustlers have been staying ahead of us because they know the territory better than we do. After the sheriff and his men departed, Marcus spent the afternoon moving his cattle to a pasture closer to the cabin, where he could keep them under observation. The work was familiar and comforting, but the specter of potential loss hung over everything like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. That evening, as he sat on his porch planning security measures for his vulnerable herd, Marcus noticed movement on the eastern ridge. A lone figure was approaching, but this time it was not Elena. The newcomer was taller, broader, moving with the deliberate gait of someone carrying significant weight or responsibility. As the distance closed, Marcus recognized the weathered face of Thomas Proudhorse, Elena's father and one of the most respected men in the territory. His presence was both an honor and a source of immediate concern. Thomas Proudhorse did not make casual visits to white ranchers, especially not at sunset when such calls might be misinterpreted by less understanding neighbors. "Mr. Thornfield," Thomas said as he approached the porch, his voice carrying the careful formality that marked interactions between cultures still learning to trust each other. "Mr. Proudhorse." "This is an unexpected honor." Marcus rose from his chair, uncertain of the proper protocol for receiving such a distinguished visitor. "My daughter tells me you are a man who understands the value of sharing what little you have. Your daughter is very wise. She taught me something important about this land." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Elena has always been able to see the character in people. It is a gift that has served our family well." He paused, studying Marcus with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "She also tells me that you have been blessed with good fortune since learning that lesson." "I have been very fortunate recently." "Fortune is a responsibility as much as a blessing. The question is whether you understand that responsibility." Marcus gestured toward the chairs on his porch, uncertain whether such an invitation would be appropriate or welcome. To his relief, Thomas accepted the offer, settling into the worn wooden seat with the careful dignity of a man accustomed to formal negotiations. "I understand that prosperity can change a man's character," Marcus said. "Your daughter warned me about that. Elena is wise, but she is also young. There are lessons about prosperity that can only be learned through experience." Thomas turned his attention to the cattle grazing in the moonlit meadow. "Those are fine animals, worth a considerable sum of money. They represent my partnership with Morrison, the foundation of what I hope will become a successful operation." "And if you lost them?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. After months of poverty and desperation, the thought of losing his cattle felt like contemplating his own death. These animals represented everything he had worked toward, the difference between success and complete failure. "I would be ruined," he admitted. "Would you?" Thomas's tone suggested that Marcus's answer revealed more than he had intended. 3 weeks ago, You had no cattle and no prospects, yet you survived. What has changed? Marcus considered the question carefully. 3 weeks ago, he had been a man with nothing left to lose, someone who could share his last meal without fear because he had already accepted the possibility of starvation. Tonight, he was a man with significant assets to protect, someone whose generosity would be limited by the need to preserve what he had gained. "I have something worth protecting now," he said finally. "And that changes how you view sharing what you have." The question exposed the exact dilemma Elena had warned him about. Prosperity had indeed changed his perspective, making him more cautious about generosity, more concerned with preserving his gains than with helping others who might be struggling as he once had. "I suppose it does," Marcus admitted. Thomas nodded as if this answer confirmed something he had already suspected. 3 days ago, a family passed through our village. White settlers heading west, their wagon broken down, their children hungry. They asked for help, and we gave them food and shelter for the night. That was generous of you. It was necessary. But what struck me was something the man said when he learned that Elena had visited your ranch. He had heard about your success, your partnership with Morrison, your fine cattle. He wondered aloud whether a prosperous rancher might have been able to help him more than we could. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I never had the opportunity to help them. They never came to my ranch. No, they did not. Because word travels quickly in this territory, and they had heard that successful men do not welcome unexpected visitors, especially poor ones." The implication stung because it contained a grain of truth. Marcus had indeed become more selective about visitors since his fortunes changed, more suspicious of people who might want to take advantage of his newfound prosperity. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that the test Elena warned you about is beginning. The land has given you abundance, but it will be watching to see whether that abundance makes you more generous or more selfish." Before Marcus could respond, Thomas stood and pointed toward the eastern ridge. "Look." Marcus followed his gaze and felt his heart stop. Silhouetted against the star-filled sky was something that defied immediate explanation. A vast herd of cattle was moving slowly across the ridge, hundreds of animals flowing like a dark river across the landscape. The sight was so unexpected, so impossible given the geography of the region, that Marcus briefly wondered if he was dreaming. "Where did they come from?" he whispered. "That depends on how you answer the question that is coming." Even as Thomas spoke, the sound of running horses reached them from the direction of town. A single rider was approaching at full gallop, pushing his mount harder than was safe in the uncertain moonlight. As the horse and rider reached the cabin, Marcus recognized one of Morrison's hands, a young man named Jake Powell, whose face was flushed with excitement and exhaustion. "Mr. Thornfield," Jake called out, barely pausing to catch his breath. "Mr. Morrison sent me to fetch you. We got a situation that needs immediate attention." "What kind of situation?" "Those rustlers hit the Jameson place tonight, made off with every head of cattle he owned, left his family with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Sheriff is organizing a posse, but we need every experienced hand we can get." Marcus looked toward his own cattle, grazing peacefully in the meadow. Joining a posse meant leaving his herd unprotected, risking everything he had worked to build. But it also meant helping a neighbor who was now experiencing the same desperation Marcus had known just weeks before. The vast herd on the ridge continued to move slowly across the horizon, a reminder that abundance could appear and disappear according to laws he was only beginning to understand. "Give me 5 minutes to saddle my horse," Marcus said. Thomas Proudhorse smiled for the first time since his arrival. "The land remembers every choice, Marcus Thornfield. Choose wisely." As Marcus prepared to ride into an uncertain night, leaving his prosperity unguarded to help a neighbor in need, the mysterious herd on the eastern ridge began to descend toward his property, bringing with them the fulfillment of a promise he was only now beginning to understand. Marcus saddled his horse with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the magnitude of the choice he was making. Every instinct developed during his years of struggle screamed at him to stay home, to protect what he had earned, to let other men risk their cattle while he preserved his own. But Elena's words echoed in his memory, reminding him that the land would be watching to see whether success changed his character. "You made the right choice," Thomas said quietly as Marcus tightened the cinch on his saddle. "But understand that this is only the beginning of the test." "What do you mean? Look around you. What do you see?" Marcus glanced toward his cabin, his flowing creek, his grazing cattle. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, exactly as it should be on a prosperous ranch. But something in Thomas's tone suggested he was missing something important. "I see my ranch. Look more carefully." Marcus studied the scene again, and this time he noticed details that had escaped his initial observation. His cattle were unusually calm for animals about to be left unguarded. They grazed with the relaxed confidence of creatures that felt completely secure, as if they knew something he did not. More puzzling was the quality of the moonlight itself. The entire landscape seemed to glow with an inner luminescence that transformed familiar features into something subtly magical. The creek sparkled like liquid silver. The grass appeared greener than it had any right to be in October, and the air carried scents of spring flowers that should not have existed at this time of year. "The land is preparing to show you something," Thomas explained, "but only if you prove worthy of the gift." Jake Powell shifted impatiently in his saddle, clearly eager to return to town with Marcus's response. "Mr. Thornfield, we need to move. Sheriff wants the posse assembled within the hour." "I am coming," Marcus replied, swinging into his saddle. As he turned his horse toward town, he caught one last glimpse of the mysterious herd on the ridge. They moved with purpose now, no longer simply crossing the landscape but actively descending toward his property. The ride to Cedar Ridge passed in a blur of moonlit countryside and growing determination. Marcus found himself thinking not about the cattle he was leaving behind, but about the Jameson family and what they must be experiencing tonight. He remembered his own darkest moments, the crushing weight of watching everything he had worked for slip away through circumstances beyond his control. By the time they reached town, Sheriff Cross had assembled nearly 20 men, a substantial force by frontier standards. The group included ranchers, merchants, and professional lawmen, all united by the understanding that cattle rustling threatened everyone's livelihood. "Glad you could join us, Thornfield," Sheriff Cross said as Marcus rode up to the assembled posse. "We are going to need every experienced hand for this operation. What is the plan?" "Track them to their camp and get those cattle back before they can move them out of the territory. Jake here got a good look at their trail before riding to get you. Thinks he can follow it even in the dark." Marcus studied the faces of the men around him, recognizing the grim determination that marked frontier justice. These were not professional soldiers, but they were men who understood that sometimes survival required taking significant risks. The posse rode out of Cedar Ridge under a canopy of stars, following a trail that led northeast toward the Badlands where outlaws traditionally made their camps. The pursuit would be dangerous, potentially deadly, but Marcus felt no doubt about his decision to join them. As they rode, he found himself thinking about the bread he had shared with Elena, the simple act of generosity that had somehow triggered this entire chain of events. At the time, sharing his last meal had felt like the desperate gesture of a defeated man. Now he understood it as the first step in a journey that was still unfolding. The trail led them through increasingly rough country, across rocky draws and up steep ridges that tested both horses and riders. Jake Powell proved to be an excellent tracker, following signs that were invisible to less experienced eyes. The rustlers had been confident in their escape, making no effort to conceal their path through the wilderness. Dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains when the posse finally spotted smoke rising from a hidden canyon ahead. Sheriff Cross called a halt, gathering the men for final instructions before the confrontation that would determine whether their night-long pursuit ended in success or disaster. "Remember, we want those cattle back, but we also want to get home alive. the sheriff said quietly. "Stay together, watch each other's backs, and do not take unnecessary risks. These men are professionals, and they will fight if cornered." As the posse prepared for what could become a pitched battle, Marcus thought about his ranch 20 miles away, where his own cattle grazed under the protection of whatever mysterious forces Elena and her father understood better than he did. For the first time since leaving home, he allowed himself to wonder what he would find when he returned. The attack came at full dawn, the posse sweeping down into the canyon like an avalanche of righteous fury. The rustlers had not expected pursuit so quickly, and their defenses crumbled under the coordinated assault. Within minutes, the stolen cattle were recovered, and the thieves either captured or scattered into the Badlands. Marcus found himself in the thick of the action, his years of struggling with uncooperative cattle serving him well in the chaos of recovering stolen herds. By the time the dust settled, he had personally reclaimed 15 head that belonged to the Jameson family, animals that represented the difference between survival and starvation for a family he had never met. The ride back to Cedar Ridge took most of the day, slowed by the need to drive recovered cattle at a sustainable pace. Marcus rode beside Jake Powell, both men exhausted but satisfied with the night's work. "Heard something interesting while we were rounding up those cattle," Jake said as they crested a hill that offered a view of the valley below. "What did you hear?" "One of the other men mentioned seeing lights on your ranch during the night. Said it looked like you had company, maybe a dozen riders or more." Marcus felt his stomach drop. In his absence, his unguarded property had apparently been visited by unknown horsemen, possibly another group of rustlers attracted by his recent prosperity. Everything he had worked to build could be gone, stolen while he was off helping strangers recover their own losses. Did anyone investigate? Too far out of the way, and we had our hands full with the pursuit. But Tom Miller said the lights disappeared just before dawn, like whoever was there had finished their business and moved on. The implications were ominous. Marcus urged his horse to a faster pace, eager to reach his ranch and assess whatever damage had been done during his absence. The choice to help the Jameson family had felt noble in the moment, but if it had cost him everything he owned, he would have to question whether generosity was worth such a price. As they approached Cedar Ridge, Marcus could see his ranch in the distance, nestled in the valley beside the sparkling creek. From this distance, everything appeared normal, but he knew that appearances could be deceiving, especially when dealing with professional thieves. "I need to check on my place," Marcus told Jake as they reached the edge of town. "Want some company? If there is trouble, you might need help." Marcus considered the offer, then shook his head. Whatever awaited him at his ranch, he preferred to face it alone. The night had taught him something important about himself, but the final lesson was still waiting to be revealed. He rode toward home with his heart hammering against his ribs, preparing himself for the worst while hoping for something better.